Welcome to this episode of Silicon Bytes. Now I'm preparing a much more detailed response to the torrent of news that we're seeing coming out about the potential US so-called negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine. For this episode, I'm going to simply read out or share some of the most insightful posts on Twitter and Blue Sky that I've seen today. This is going to be a set of fleeting impressions and opinions, but ones nonetheless that I'll be unpacking in a lot more detail in an episode tomorrow, the day after, and probably over the next couple of weeks. The theme of this episode is negotiations or capitulation. What does the US really want out of this process that has begun with Russia? After the meeting between Russia and the US, there are questions, but few answers. One of the questions asked is, can you take us a little bit through the atmosphere in the room today? What was the interaction like? How would you characterize the discussions? One of the delegation members from the US side, Mr. WITKOFF, said it was positive, upbeat, constructive. Everybody was there to get the right outcome, solutions-based. We discussed it afterwards. We couldn't have imagined a better result after this session. It was very, very solid. That, of course, is not the impression that a lot of people who are experts on the region, but nonetheless were not invited to these negotiations, will hold. Matthew Miller, for instance, on Twitter said, negotiating an end to a war is easy if you plan to surrender. John Sipher, who's been on the Silicon Curtain channel, said Russia is at its weakest in years. Putin is in a precarious situation. They are attacking Western interests around the world and murdering Europeans. Why is Rubio bending a knee and showing weakness? David Frum, also on Twitter, said when FDR struck an over-the-heads of Eastern Europe deal at Yalta in February 1945, Stalin had 300 plus divisions in the field versus Nazi Germany. The impending unilateral Trump sellout of Ukraine occurs when Putin is battered and almost broken. Garry Kasparov responded to that again on Twitter. This looks more like Molotov-Ribbentrop than Yalta. It's business dividing up Ukraine for profit, and they will try and may even succeed unless Europe acts quickly instead of just talking. Timofey Milofanov quotes what Lavrov said after the talks. Trump was one of the first Western leaders to say that drawing Ukraine to NATO is the main reason for what is happening. We don't agree to stop attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure because we never attacked it. Zelensky must be constrained so he does not attack us. Lavrov also said the US and Russian differences are small. The US wants to get peace. Lavrov also said the presence of troops from the same NATO countries but under a different flag, whether the EU or national, changes nothing. It's unacceptable. Well, let's unpack these comments before we get to the next quote. NATO is not the cause of the war. It's the lack of NATO protection for Ukraine that let Putin believe he could attack. So, of course, Trump repeating this Kremlin lie is an absolute gift to Lavrov and the other propagandists. The idea that differences between the US and a genocidal regime that slaughters Ukrainians are very small, that's either not true or else it's true yet deeply, deeply disturbing. And finally, Lavrov's objection to any NATO troops, any EU troops, any individual NATO or EU nation sending troops to Ukraine. Well, it's clear what Russia is after. They're after a Ukraine which cannot defend itself and a Ukraine which is not defended by its allies either. Well, neither of those scenarios is good, neither of those scenarios should be acceptable. Yaroslav Trofimov said, quoting Zelensky, "It seems like Russia and the US are preparing an ultimatum to Ukraine, talking about Ukraine without Ukraine. We didn't accept ultimatums in 2022 when the situation was much more serious and no one was helping us. And I have no intention of accepting any ultimatums now. The Trump administration is open that its aim in all this is to woo Russia away from China. Putin will be all too happy to pocket the strategic windfall, but Russia's bond with China will remain permanent because any US-Russia rapprochement is temporary by nature. No one knows which way the next US administration will swing. Well, that last quote was from Yaroslav Trofimov, and in response to that, Alexander Djokic, who has also been on Silicon Curtain, said, Russia is fully dependent on China, and any strategy to appease Russia by gifting it a Yalta-style sphere of influence in Eastern Europe to turn it against China is doomed to fail. This is not a Nixon moment. Yaroslav Trofimov also writes, doom and gloom in Munich as the transatlantic alliance fractures. Everybody understands that now is the European hour. The only question is whether the jolt will be enough for the patient to wake up. I'm worrying that the jolt might just kill the patient. Also, Trofimov requotes a phrase given in a recent interview by General Philip Breedlove. We have purposefully been slow at training F-16 pilots for Ukraine, says retired US Air Force General Philip Breedlove, a former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. We didn't want to do it quickly because that might affect the war. We in the West are morally and intellectually incapable of conceiving a defeated Russia and a defeated Putin. Anton Gerashenko writes on Twitter, Russian propagandist Solovyov has his own ideas on what Russia and the US should negotiate. Why not create a military coalition between Russia and America and divide Europe, says Solovyov. Who needs it? I think it's a great idea. We'll set up our bases without a hitch at the usual points: Berlin, Paris, as in 1814. Europe will immediately save money on the armed forces, on the military-industrial complex, and they won't have to worry about anything. Benjamin Tallis writes, Europe is far more directly exposed and drastically more vulnerable than the US to the consequences of what happens in Ukraine. And here is somebody I don't like quoting, but it's interesting to see the way his mind works. This is on Twitter from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Dear Zelensky, the American people will not accept hard-earned tax dollars fueling endless conflicts. We demand an end to these forever wars. It's time for peace. The perpetual funding is over. And in response to this, another guest from the channel, Vasilina Orlova, writes, why are you demanding the end of the war from the victim of the invasion, which is Ukraine, and not from the aggressor, which is Russia? Andrew A. Michter, also who's been on the channel, writes a long thread. Let's understand where we are. If Ukraine is abandoned, what's left of the security architecture in Europe will unravel in short order, and the consequences will be felt in other theatres, including the Indo-Pacific. The likelihood of a general war in Europe will increase. No matter how we spin it, any deal that ratifies Russia's territorial gains in Ukraine and forecloses Kiev's path to membership in NATO will be a systematic win for Putin, one where Russia defeated not only Ukraine, but also the West. Our defeat will reverberate in other theatres. Much has been written about historical analogies to Ukraine's unfolding tragedy, but instead of revisiting the ghosts from the past, we should think of the monsters yet to come. If Ukraine is abandoned, our ability to act in collective defence will be questioned by our foes. Deterrence rests on both having the requisite capabilities and the will to use them. Since Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, then Ukraine in 2014 and 2022, we agonized over red lines, showing that while we have the capabilities, we lack the will to back our rhetoric with force. Today, the West's future hangs in the balance, not only because, after 20 years of appeasing Russia, we're about to give Putin his greatest victory to date, We've shown repeatedly that we have no intestinal fortitude to stand firm when challenged, and our enemies are watching. Johnny Ascola writes on Twitter, is it even possible for the US to go lower than that? Russia is bombing Ukrainian civilians while the US is discussing restoring economic ties. Jessica Berlin, another guest from the channel, writes, Russia doesn't want to end the war. They want to end Ukraine, dismantle democratic alliances, and reshape the world order in their image. Good luck negotiating, Secretary Rubio. Lavrov will eat Rubio alive. Let this meeting make America look weak. They'll hate that and try to compensate later. In the meantime, European countries need to announce aid packages, sanctions crackdowns, troop commitments, and Russian asset seizure. Jimmy Rushton on Twitter writes, Moscow and Washington seem to assume Ukraine's position on the battlefield is so difficult, Kiev will be forced to agree to any terms proposed. This is completely false. Ukraine can and will continue to fight if presented with unacceptable terms, with or without US support. Slavomir Debsky writes on Twitter, the Russian negotiating team in Riyadh is to consist of Yuri Ushakov, the Kremlin's chief foreign policy advisor, who's worked in diplomacy for over half a century, Sergei Narishkin, Ushakov's top spy, who served alongside Putin in the Soviet KGB, Kirill Dmitriev, a financier educated at Stanford and Harvard, who has ties to the Kremlin chief's family and, according to the publication, could play a key role in an unofficial back channel to Trump's negotiators. A rumor says that Vladimir Medinsky is to join the Russian team in Riyadh. He is a former Minister of Culture. Now he is Putin's key advisor on ideological aspects of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Timothy Schneider, again on Twitter, writes, the American team has almost no experience in high-level international negotiations, no regional expertise on Ukraine and Russia, and no relevant foreign language knowledge. That is not true of the Russians, to put it mildly. This looks like a diplomatic bloodbath by design. Again, Jessica Berlin, writing on Twitter, says, despite the Kremlin's attempts to mask economic damage, Western sanctions have triggered a currency crisis that directly impacts Russia's ability to finance its war effort. Now imagine what would happen to the Russian economy if the EU would crack down on sanctions dodging. If we don't even bother to enforce our own sanctions, no wonder Washington doesn't take us seriously. And here's another guest, previous guest from the channel, Ilya Ponomarenko. Cool, Putin gets premium treatment as a revered dear partner, as well as everything he has stolen and even much more. Ukraine gets a spit in the face, an extorted $500 billion bill, no security guarantees, and a guaranteed new Russian offensive to kill it as soon as Russia is ready. The funniest thing is that, of course, most of the money allocated to Ukraine aid was spent in America, so that American enterprises and American workers and engineers could produce weapons, munitions, and equipment for the Ukrainian military under American government contracts, or replace hardware from old stocks sent to Ukraine. But who cares? I'm not even talking about the Budapest piece of paper, or a chance to deter and repel Russia's imperialist expansion without a single American soldier sent to fight. All right, let's break it down once again for those who are new to the discussion. 1. Russia didn't start a war of annihilation because Ukraine wanted NATO. Ukraine wants NATO because Russia is waging a war of annihilation. 2. Ukraine is not fighting Russia because it was wrong to trust America. Ukraine is fighting because Russia is trying to wipe it off the map. And Ukraine is doing everything humanly possible to survive as a free, independent nation instead of being crushed under a totalitarian, fascist regime. 3. Russia's so-called peace deal has never been anything but Ukraine's destruction and absorption. That's not on Zelensky, Boris Johnson, or even George Soros. The only one responsible is Vladimir Putin's fascist regime, which launched the biggest war in Europe since Adolf Hitler to reconquer its former colony. Not everything in this world is some grand conspiracy theory for decadent Westerners obsessed with self-hatred to the point of blindly worshipping foreign dictators that undermine the West. And here's another comment on Twitter from Mario. Erdogan just threw down the gauntlet. Turkey backs Ukraine's full territorial integrity. Turkey isn't just some side player in this. They control the Black Sea. They control NATO's southern flank. And now Erdogan is making it clear Russia's land grab is not up for negotiation. Erdogan doesn't support the annexation of Crimea and its Tatar population. Also, with the US mess, he'd love to fill a power vacuum in Europe. Erdogan is on Team Erdogan. No one else is. Well, let's end this episode of Quotations with President Volodymyr Zelensky, who usually finds the right words at the right time. Russia in its current state needs war to maintain its grip on power, and it proves its intent to keep fighting by bombarding Ukraine every single day. This week alone, Russia has launched nearly 1,220 aerial bombs, over 850 attack drones, and more than 40 missiles of various types against our people. Ukraine is defending itself. We stand and fight thanks to the bravery of our warriors and the support of our partners. But we need more air defense systems to protect Ukrainian lives. Europe and the world must be better protected from such evil and prepared to confront it. This requires a strong, united foreign policy and pressure on Putin, who started this war and is now expanding it globally. This is what we've been saying on this channel for a very long time, and we've been pointing out the consequences of letting Russia's evil flourish and expand, and gifting to Putin absolute impunity for his crimes. It seems that the consequences are only growing, and the costs of dealing with this resurgent evil are only growing and growing the longer we delay.